Before most people felt fear, a few Americans already knew something was terribly wrong. When RMS Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., many passengers thought it was minor. But several wealthy American travelers in first class noticed something others didn't. The engines had stopped, the vibration was gone, the silence felt unnatural. Men like John Jacob Astor IV stepped onto the deck to investigate. Because they understood one thing about ships: engines don't stop unless something is very wrong. Within minutes, whispers began spreading through the American cabins. Benjamin Guggenheim dressed carefully instead of panicking. Isidor Straus quietly asked direct questions to the crew. They weren't hysterical. They were calculating, because powerful American businessmen understood risk, and the crew's faces were giving away the truth. If you value research-driven storytelling like this, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, because no one else can give you research-driven videos like ours. Up on deck, the lifeboats were being uncovered, but no one had been told the ship was sinking. Not yet. In first class, the Americans began comparing notes. They had traveled the world. They understood the difference between routine inconvenience and controlled panic. When water started creeping into lower corridors, stewards avoided eye contact. That was the tell. John Jacob Astor IV directly asked an officer if the ship was seriously damaged. The reply was calm. Too calm. Precautionary measures, they said. But experienced men knew something didn't add up. The lifeboats weren't being uncovered for practice, and the tilt of RMS Titanic was no illusion. It was increasing. In first class, the Americans began comparing notes. They had traveled the world. They understood the difference between routine inconvenience and controlled panic. When water started creeping into lower corridors, stewards avoided eye contact. That was the tell. John Jacob Astor IV directly asked an officer if the ship was seriously damaged. The reply was calm. Too calm. Precautionary measures, they said. But experienced men knew something didn't add up. The lifeboats weren't being uncovered for practice. And the tilt of RMS Titanic was no illusion. It was increasing. Around midnight, the slope became undeniable. Glasses on tables began to slide. Doors no longer closed cleanly. And several American passengers quietly moved their families closer to the boat deck. Margaret Brown later recalled sensing tension in the crew's voices. It wasn't what they said. It was what they avoided saying. Below, watertight compartments were already filling. Designer Thomas Andrews had done the math. The ship could survive 4 flooded compartments. 6 were breached. But that calculation wasn't announced publicly. Not to the Americans. Not to anyone. Yet. Then came the moment the Americans feared most. Thomas Andrews began quietly telling select first-class passengers the truth. The ship would sink. Isidor Straus refused early offers to board a lifeboat. His wife chose to stay with him. John Jacob Astor IV asked detailed questions about how long they had. An hour, maybe a little more. That was the window. Some American families acted immediately. Others hesitated, still trusting the word unsinkable. But the bow of RMS Titanic was now visibly dipping into the Atlantic, and time was no longer theoretical. By 12:45 a.m., the first lifeboats were lowering into the Black Atlantic. They weren't full, not even close. Many Americans hesitated because the ship still looked safer than a small wooden boat in freezing darkness. Margaret Brown urged women to get in. Crew members struggled to convince families this was not a drill. From the rail, some American men calculated the odds. Stay on a 46,000-ton liner or step into a half-filled lifeboat swinging above icy water. The band kept playing, the lights still burned bright, and that illusion of control convinced dozens to wait. It was a fatal miscalculation. By 2 a.m., panic replaced dignity. The stern of RMS Titanic was rising higher into the freezing sky. American survivors later described the sound as something unnatural. Metal groaning, rivets snapping, china crashing below deck. In Lifeboat 6, Margaret Brown urged the crew to row back and rescue swimmers. They refused, they feared being pulled under. From the water, voices screamed in American accents. Bankers, students, fathers, men who had understood the danger too late. And then, at 2:20 a.m., the lights went out. The pride of the Atlantic disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only darkness and the sound of hundreds calling for help. The screaming lasted less than 10 minutes. Then the Atlantic went silent. In the lifeboats, American survivors sat frozen, listening. Some wanted to row back, others refused. Fear won. Hours later, flares lit the horizon. It was the RMS Carpathia, racing through ice at full speed after catching the distress signal. When it arrived, what it found shocked the world. Among the rescued were some of America's wealthiest names. Among the dead were even more. Newspapers in New York City would soon turn the disaster into headlines, blame, and political pressure. But one question haunted survivors most. Who knew first, and could more have been saved? When the rescued Americans reached New York City aboard the RMS Carpathia, the nation demanded answers. How could the unsinkable RMS Titanic vanish on her maiden voyage? Senate hearings began within days. Survivors testified under oath. Some American passengers admitted they sensed the danger early. They saw the engines stop. They saw the crew's expressions change. They felt the deck tilt. But hesitation, trust, and pride bought them fatal minutes. History remembers the Iceberg. But what if the real turning point was human delay? If you had been there that night, would you have trusted the ship or the silence?